Hey guys, thanks for joining us. We're going to take a few minutes and talk about the fundamentals of commercial leasing. My name is Mark Hulsey. I'm the managing broker of RE/MAX Results Commercial Group, and I'm joined today with
Hayden Hulsey.
So we're going to take just a few minutes. So commercial leasing, you guys, many times I think people kind of underestimate what commercial leasing is all about. And commercial leasing, in my opinion, is as complicated, sometimes actually a lot more complicated than on the sales side of things. There's a lot to commercial leasing. And there's also a big distinction between, are you on the landlord side or are you on the tenant side? The negotiations between those differences is substantial. And so you literally kind of got to put on the landlord hat or put on the tenant hat as we're going through the process, working through any type of commercial lease. We're talking about office, industrial, and retail. That's kind of the focus of what we're doing. We're not talking about multifamily leasing or the leasing of apartments. That's not what we do. We do sell multifamily assets, but when it comes to leasing, our focus is office, retail, and industrial. Leasing is just like commercial real estate sales in the sense that it's cyclical. So we are in a changing market environment right now as we're in kind of the summer of 2020 with a lot going on out in the world, and we can go from a landlord market to a tenant market, and that's kind of what's just happened here, and it's happened very, very rapidly. And so similarly with sales, it can become a seller's market or a buyer's market. So first, let's start, just hit a couple high points on the cost, the cost of doing commercial leasing. Hayden, you want to take that for a second?
Sure. Yeah, so there's kind of four main points in the cost here. The first is base rent, CAM, tax, insurance. That's what you're actually paying. So just to kind of go through those, base rent, let's say that's 20 bucks a square foot. CAM is common area maintenance. So those are all the operating expenses. Those are, lawn care, snow, window cleaning, utilities. So like an office building, you're gonna have those all shared, and then you're paying your pro rata share. Same with taxes. So you'll usually see CAM, tax, and then insurance will usually be in there too, as a per square foot number. So let's just say you have $20 per square foot for your base rent, $10 for CAM and tax. Your true cost is then $30 a square foot. That would be your gross amount. So that's, depending on what kind of lease you have, a triple net versus a gross. Usually on office, industrial, a lot of retail, if it's higher end, nicer product, you're going to see more of that triple net. The second piece to address here is going to be escalations. So in most all leases, you're going to see an escalation based on your base rent. CAM and tax and those items, of course, adjust annually based on where the operating comes in, and then the taxes if those go up or down. The escalations, you're usually seeing somewhere in the 2 to 3% range. Completely depends on the product, the scenario. And then security deposit. So that's another big one. Tenants are always asking, what do I need to put down to go secure this space when I sign a lease? It varies, but it's usually somewhere in the 1 to 2 months of your gross rent. Personal guarantee, this is kind of the fourth piece here. It's not a cost per se, but it's an important piece to understand, because if you're especially a startup, any good landlord is going to, require you to sign a personal guarantee, because you could have this in ABC LLC and you have no assets in there and you have nothing behind that corporation or LLC, so you need to back that up personally. Even if you're established, depending on the product, that landlord might be requiring a personal guarantee. The second point here, which Mark will touch on, is build-out and tenant improvement.
TI. So you hear these acronyms thrown around in commercial real estate all the time. When it comes to commercial leasing, TI is probably the big dog. TI is tenant improvements. And so it's kind of a very key part of all negotiations with commercial real estate. So tenant improvements is kind of the same as essentially building out. When you get a building like this, and let's just say we bring it down to the vanilla shell, and of course that's kind of what you would think, and that's just our bare walls, bare floors, and now we need to take it out from there. And so we're sitting in a gorgeous building here in downtown Minneapolis, a beautiful office building that this is actually a listing of ours. And to build out a space like this is very expensive. And so when I say very expensive, you might be looking at a build out cost on a per square foot basis of anywhere from 70, 80, $100 per square foot. So now we get into TI, and TI is the tenant improvement allowance. So when we're negotiating, of course you negotiate off your base rate if you're able to, and then tenant improvement allowance. Now some landlords will offer up a TI allowance, some landlords won't. Some will simply say, nope, all TI, all improvements are going to have to be paid by the tenant. Good landlords, well-funded, well-capitalized landlords, if they want a good tenant in for a long term that's creating a tremendous amount of income, they know they too have to pay to play. And so that comes into the TI, and many times as we're negotiating for, say, a Class A office space on a 10-year term, that's a lot of money, that's a 10-year period that's creating income, it's not uncommon to have that tenant require somewhere in the range of maybe $40 per square foot for a TI allowance. Now, understand that that's the landlord contribution. That means the tenant's not off the hook. The tenant themselves may have another $40, $50, or $60 themselves per square foot that they need to contribute to get that build out exactly where it needs to be. Sometimes some tenants will simply come in and they'll take whatever the tenant or the landlord is giving them for the TI allowance. Sometimes we need to work through the process of getting a couple contractor bids so we can absolutely quantify how much the TI is going to cost us, and that becomes part of the negotiation. So TI can get very complicated, and but a really important piece. So the next thing we're going to talk about is lease term, because lease term essentially is, do we deal 3-year, 5-year, 10-year? And Hayden, why don't you take that for just a second?
Yeah, so this is really crucial here because the lease term is, of course, what brings in all that income, and it seems really basic, but what you need to understand is all the previous points that we discussed about TI allowance and all that depends upon the lease term. So just, for example, it's basically saying, what is that lease worth? So you're taking your base rent, CAM, tax, insurance over that period of, say, 5 years. So just for example, if we said, what's that, retail storefront at, with 2,000 square feet on a 5-year term, and let's say, the base rate is $22 a square foot. That means you're taking that, that $22 a foot times that 2,000 to get you your annual dollars, multiply that by 5 years, that's $220,000. So just to kind of wrap your head around that, just think if you have, a lease where that tenant needs, say, $40 a square foot to go build out that space, the landlord has to look at his net numbers. How much is that lease bringing in? How much am I dishing out, including, also leasing commissions, to see if it even makes sense. Length is the other piece here. So we see a lot of, so say it's a smaller, retail or office building, you see a lot of leases in that 5-year range. You'll see down to, 3 years, but you start to get down to, 1 or 2 years, usually the numbers just don't make sense. For brokers to lease it, there's almost no money there. For a landlord to kick in anything, doesn't make sense. A tenant doesn't usually want to build something out if they only have 1 or 2 years there. So usually it's in that kind of 5-year range for that stuff. Nicer, bigger spaces, you get into 7 and 10. Now naturally with the lease term, if a tenant is negotiating and they can bump up their lease term from, say, 5 to 7 years, that puts more money in that landlord's pocket in theory, giving them more leverage for better terms from a landlord. One of the pieces here too in our unique market is, we are starting to see some shorter lease terms. There's uncertainty with, where's that company going to be in, say 3 to 5 years? Do we need more space, less space? Are people working from home more? That's talking more on office. Retail has been a, dynamic market overall over the last, couple of years here. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, but it's still kind of somewhere in that, 5-ish year range. The last piece to address here is termination clauses. So you'll see within leases, and this is getting kind of specific, but you'll see a tenant that might commit to say a 5 or a 7-year lease. However, they want a termination clause at year 3. What that means is that gives them an out. Any good landlord isn't just gonna say, sure, because that dramatically changes the income that lease is bringing in. Usually the happy medium there is going to be, a tenant could get out at, say, 3 years if the landlord agrees. However, they're going to pay for it, and then they're also going to pay back any unamortized cost. So it at least puts some money in the landlord's pocket, recoups some of that build out and those leasing commissions.
Our next section, you guys, we're going to talk about that we're going to wrap up on is use. And so use sounds pretty basic, right? But it isn't. And so when it comes to commercial leasing and understanding use, it's critical. It's so important. And what do I mean by that? Many people, if you're not accustomed to doing this, you may take a look and say, I've got a building, I can put whatever I want in that building. Of course, that's far from the truth. You can't necessarily just go put a church or a child care or a daycare into a building like that. Obviously, first thing what we're doing is we're taking a look at the zoning, and we're looking at the zoning permitted uses, or might it require a conditional use permit. Sometimes, of course, even when it gets into sale kinds of things, we can look at rezoning, but that's really kind of pushing it. So first and foremost, we need to understand the zoning is matching up to the use for the tenant. Number two, we need to make sure that, say we're in a multi-tenant situation. Let's say it's a retail strip, and you've got 4 different tenants, or there's a Subway. Well, do you think Subway is going to go allow a Jimmy John's or some other sandwich shop to be right next door to them? Usually not. So there's a level of exclusivity many times that goes along with particular building spaces, and that's especially true in retail. It might be a hair salon. They don't want another hair salon, massage, whatever it might be, chiropractor. They're going to be the sole person within that group that's going to work there.
It's usually not in the landlord's best interest, naturally, to create that kind of competition, because it's going to drive one tenant out most of the time anyway. So even if it's not exclusive, why would you want 2 of your tenants competing directly to where one would, in theory, fail at that location?
You bet. And so also kind of with use, you guys, it does come down to landlord approval. We can't forget the landlord still needs to say what type of mix do they want within their office building, what do they want within their retail building. This is so critical because, again, many people will think that, well, if there's a vacant space, a landlord should be willing to put anybody in there just to create income, and it doesn't work that way. In fact, far from it. There can be a lot more risk and problems just putting anybody in there. So you need to get landlord approval. They want to make sure that they've got the right type of tenant mix as well as income, because if they need to go sell that asset, it all comes down to the value of that asset is based on the tenancy and the money behind that tenancy. So it's very, very important. And then there's all these other kinds of factors that come into play, such as ingress, egress, access, parking, all of these other pieces, but they shouldn't be underestimated because parking are things that are driven by city ordinances. And so if you're going to be a church or a daycare or things like that, there's lots of other regulations that go with those things when it comes down to the use. Guys, we could talk for a day about commercial leasing and all the nuances and the differences between office versus retail versus industrial, but this just kind of gives you a start to know that as you're diving into it, be conscious that there is a lot to it. If you want to know more about who we are and what we do, of course, check out our website, resultscommercial.com. Find us on social media, but we appreciate your time today. Thank you.